Thank you, everybody. You're all very patient, hanging in this long. As David mentioned, I am an Eisenhower Fellow, and I was going to start today telling you a kind of charming story about Kimball Chen, who's one of the trustees, who you can see pictured up there, but I think it's a little late in the day, and I think Kimball himself, I understand, is going to turn up at some point during the conference. So if you're very interested, you can ask me about that one later. Really, it's very, very good to be here. And one of the things, we joke about Australia being a small island, but one of the things that I think many people here might not understand is that Australia is, in fact, one of the most urbanised countries in the world, just trailing the city-states like Singapore. And we have a lot to, the Australian Tourism Board has a lot to answer for because, of course, you all probably imagine Australia as a wide brown land populated by kangaroos and crocodiles and a big desert. But of course, very few Australians live in those places, and the vast majority of Australians live in the big metropolitan centres that dot the coastline. So being here, we actually have quite a great deal in common with the big Asian cities as you seek to kind of build your cities of the future. What I will acknowledge is that actually you are much further advanced in your thinking than we are about these questions, and today has been absolutely inspiring, and I really congratulate the Singaporean and Malaysian fellows because it's been a wonderful, wonderful conference for me. What I want to do today is just share a little bit of the Australian experience in urban development. I think some of the context is similar, some of it's quite different. You may take away from it some things that are useful, and some of it you may reject as just irrelevant to your situation. So bear with me. I'm doing my best to communicate something that I hope you'll find interesting. Look, all of the photos on this slide are taken from current property brochures that are out there in the Australian marketplace from Australian property developers. And you can see that they depict communities that have certain characteristics. We see pictures of kids on bikes. That's about communities where people are able to be physically active. We see people undertaking activities together, and we can see that residential buyers are looking for opportunities to feel part of some community experience. And you can see up in that top corner a dwelling that's obviously got some really obvious features to enable sustainability. So it's got water tanks, and it's got some very hardy plants that don't need very much water, and it's got some solar passive design features. And the really interesting thing about this, and I raise it, is because in the Australian context, the livability and sustainability agenda is not really being driven very hard by government. There are some features of the Australian regulatory and planning arrangements that drive towards performance, sustainability and livability performance. But for the most part, this is being led by the industry, and it's the industry making a decision that there is a market appetite for some of the features and characteristics of livable and sustainable communities. And, it seems counterintuitive because we often think that if we want business to produce a public good, something that goes beyond the commercial bottom line, we have to really put the big stick out there. But that has not been the experience in the Australian property sector. Essentially, what the market is responding to in Australia is a sort of demand for functioning communities. And what we like to say in the business that I work for is that people these days are buying into places as well as into spaces. They don't just want a house that's nice for them, they want a community they can be part of. There is community pressure for performance, not just from the people buying into the community, but the people living around these new communities. And the communities will use both the courts and political pressure to place pressure on governments to do better, and place pressure on the businesses themselves to do better if they feel that the planned performance for these new developments isn't good enough. And finally, in that context, if you are a private sector property developer, being a safe pair of hands makes a real difference in your ability to get engagement from government when you're trying to get approval for a big property. If government knows that you have a track record on delivering on these other public good benefits, it's a much easier pathway for you through the system because you're perceived as being low risk. Okay, so the second part of my speech really goes to what that then means in terms of engaging communities. If you need the community's permission to move forward, how do you do it? Well, one of the things that we know is that to engage communities, you need to really give them the right information to make a decision. And without information, communities are prone to sometimes having knee-jerk reactions, or I'm sure many of you have experienced that in your own cities. And technology, and particularly geospatial technology, gives us some real opportunities to give communities the information they need to make good decisions about plans for their cities. I want to talk you through just an example derived from the ACOM, the business I work for, and we have a tool, and there are other tools out there in the marketplace, but this one's called SIM, and it's basically a GIS tool that lets you evaluate the performance, a planned performance of a precinct that you're putting together. You essentially can punch in sort of the KPIs that you're after, depending on your priorities, and we've talked about a lot of those today. You then put in the sort of shape of the plan, the planned precinct that you are hoping to create, and then you can evaluate the performance. I want to show you a really nice example, and this goes to the question of communicating with the community. We had a client that had got themselves into a really tight spot. They had this patch of land, and you can see that it's a big empty site in the middle of a very dense area in a city. The community was in a real state about this development. They liked their suburb as it was. They didn't want to see any change, and the approval authority was getting extremely nervous about the level of community agitation. There's a real risk for our client that the proposal would be substantially delayed or even stopped. And I think many of you will know this is a typical response to a new development in an existing area. And the developer felt that the project had real benefits to the community, but was having trouble getting the message across, and the community was asking to see the evidence. Now, we knew, and our client knew, that the key issues for the community were access to open space and parks and access to transport. And they believed that the development would make the results on both those criteria worse. And so the client asked us to assemble the evidence base to convince the community that actually it was going to be okay. And so this is kind of the results of some of our assessment. This is the before picture, and you can see that we didn't just look at the site, we looked at all of the areas around the site. So all of this is the existing development around the site. And so you can see that beforehand, the proportion of people who had access to a local or major park was at 86%. And the community feared that an influx of people would, and a whole lot of new development would make that worse. But of course, when you actually look at the evidence and you present it to the community in this way, in a visual way that they can understand, what you started to see was actually the proportion of people who were within walking distance of a major piece of public open space actually increased. So it went up to 88% from a previous 86%. Similarly, on the question of access to bus stops, so access to public transport, it was initially around 89% of people were within walking distance of an existing bus stop. But of course, afterwards, because of the increased permeability of this site and the fact that people could walk through it, not because of any major increase in the availability of transport, the number of people who were within walking distance of a major public transport route actually increased to 90%. And so the outcome of actually presenting some evidence about this complex set of questions in a compelling and visual way was actually that the community calmed down. And when the approval authority saw that the community had calmed down, they were then far more relaxed about allowing the development to proceed. And I just really like this story because it tells you something about the real challenges of getting these proposals through in existing communities where resistance to change can be so entrenched. Now that's actually the end of my time. Oh no, I have 2 minutes. I basically have a second example which is slightly different but goes to some similar themes, and it's really just about looking at choices. So this second example is when we're a little bit earlier in the process, looking at 3 different ways of laying out a suburb. And this basically analysed, it was the same piece of land, and it looked at different configurations of the commercial, industrial and residential development on this particular site, and there were 3 options in play. The first piece of analysis we did looked at how much what the energy performance would be of that site. And you can see that the overall energy performance saw option 2 have a far better performance. Interestingly, actually, option 1, and I haven't shown this here, was much better suited for a district energy solution, because you see a concentration in that layout of all of the high energy consumption facilities in the one place. But, option 2 was the lowest overall energy consumption. When it came to water, you also saw that the layout in option 2 was, actually produced a much lower level of water consumption than the other options that were being contemplated by the developer. But when it came to transport accessibility, and in particular accessibility to major district bus stops, option 2 performed particularly badly. And there were many other variables analysed when we did this piece, but I show you this because, of course, there are trade-offs to be made by communities when we're considering the options for any development, and they can be complex and difficult to communicate. And one of the challenges for us is to actually be creative, not to blame the community for having difficulty in understanding these problems, but to find ways to assist and enable the community to get across the information and to be able to participate in a meaningful way. And really that was, I guess, the point of my presentation. That's another nice picture. But was simply to say this, that if we want denser cities in particular, and we know that density is a key criteria for strong performance against a range of metrics, we are going to have to deal with some ingrained resistance to change, and we all need to work very, very hard to find mechanisms by which we can engage the community on both the benefits and the costs, and indeed the trade-offs associated with particular models of development.